2, 1.
Hello, my name is Bob Schaible. I am chair of Maine Voices for Palestinian Rights, and it is my distinct pleasure to be welcoming to Maine David Sheen. David has come to Maine to give a lecture and a presentation on the question of race in Israel. So I would like to start, David, by saying that I know you are originally from Toronto, and then you moved to Israel in 1999. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, what motivated you to move to Israel?
Well, I'm an Israeli citizen by birth. My father was born there, and his parents were born there. So I'd always spent summers with my family, with my extended family in Israel. So, after 25 years growing up in Canada, and in cold Canada, I wanted to live in Israel, for various different reasons, some climactic, some ideological. I grew up in a Zionist family, and I went to a Jewish school and a Jewish youth group and Jewish synagogue and Jewish neighborhood. And I guess I was kind of a person who felt like I wanted to contribute to something greater than myself. And because of my education, I was taught that this collective that I was a part of, the Jewish people and the Israeli people, that they needed help, that they needed people to contribute of themselves to. So me wanting to be a goody two-shoes type, ended up moving there. I was at the age of 25 in 1999.
So you went over there a full believer in the Zionist cause, and then what changed, and how long had you been there before it changed, and what led to change?
Yeah. Well, as I said, my understanding of what happens there is really informed by my education, both formal and informal. But the narrative was wholly the Jewish narrative, the Israeli narrative, the Zionist narrative. And so whether that was, reinforced by my family members or reinforced by these teen tours that I was taken on that are quite popular. But it was when I began living there for the first time on my own as an adult, navigating society and just coming into contact with people and observing things for myself. Within 1 or 2 months, everything changed for me. Yeah.
So you had an opportunity to meet and talk with some Palestinians?
Exactly. It was just meeting. It seems strange to say this, but growing up in Toronto, even though it's super multicultural, I just hadn't come into contact. I knew Muslim people, I knew Arab people, but I didn't know any Palestinian people. And I met Palestinian people for the first time when I was living, intimately, getting to know someone past the first hi. Only really when I moved to Israel. And just from coming into contact and getting to know one another and having an understanding about what their lives were like, first of all, just humanizing them. It seems trite, but they're humans just like me, they're not blah, blah, blah. But also coming to realize about their circumstances, that I realized what that meant to be under occupation and what that meant to be discriminated against in a state that was unequivocally not dedicated to your ethnic group, but specifically to preserve the rights and privileges of the other ethnic group, what that feels like. And once I heard those stories, once I understand this system, and it came into conflict with my own my own conscience, my own desire for social justice. So that's when the break.
Did you go into the West Bank? Or did you just talk with ones you met in Jerusalem? Or did you go into the West Bank?
This was even in Tel Aviv, actually, because Palestinian people would come into Tel Aviv to do construction work. I'm referring now to Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, those who live in the West Bank, but who come to do various jobs. And just from my own home was a bit of a construction site. There was renovations on the building I lived in, and just walking in and out of the building, getting to know the hey, how are you doing, and talking to them, and sitting with them, and having a drink with them, and having a lunch with them, just getting to know them. At that time, it was the Oslo years, so it was possible to go into the West Bank. And I did on occasion, even though I lived in Tel Aviv, I would occasionally go into the West Bank, and yeah, then I did also have some opportunities to meet Palestinian people there. But within a couple of years, the Second Intifada broke out, and after that, it became more dangerous and certainly legally problematic for Israeli citizens to enter the West Bank. Yeah.
Well, you have, in the course of your work, which is focused largely on African refugees and also various racist policies against African Jews, I believe, or Middle Eastern Jews from Arab countries. When did you start doing that work? What led you into that?
Well, it wasn't until a decade after I first moved to Israel that I really began working as a journalist. I'd been blogging for 10 years, but it was only in 2010 that I began working as a journalist, first editing and reporting for Haaretz, daily
I should have
newspaper.
mentioned earlier, by the way, I should let our audience know.
Yeah.
That you were an editor at Haaretz, which is commonly referred to over here as Israel's New York Times, and that you also have been had work or been covered in places like the Daily Beast, the Electric Intifada, the CTC, CNT, Canadian.
I've been interviewed for Canadian.
But quite a few, Al Jazeera. So your work has been covered, and you have provided material for these various agencies, news agencies, to use, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so you said it was about 10 years after you got there that you began to get involved in journalism, and then at some point you got focused on the race issue. So tell us more about that.
Sure. Well, as I said, I started working as a journalist, really editing for Haaretz, and that mainly meant translating the news on the Hebrew site into English for the English-speaking audience. But, I was a bit of a keener, and I wanted to write, and so I would look for stories that weren't being covered. Well, there was a glaring story that wasn't being covered, and that was the story of these African refugees. So, just briefly for people who are unfamiliar, we're talking about approximately 60,000 people from East Africa in the main, and they migrated to Israel between the years of 2006 and 2012. In those 6 years, we have 60,000 people coming in. These are not Jewish people, Christian, Muslim, pagan, different spiritual backgrounds, and fleeing political persecution, fleeing ethnic cleansing, fleeing horrors on the African continent, and people going in every which direction. And there's refugee camps all over Africa and further abroad to Europe, United States, Australia. But 60,000 walked through the desert, the Sinai Desert, and entered Israel. Now, when they first arrived, the government really didn't know what to do about it, but they just said, okay, well, come on in. But very quickly they decided, okay, we don't want to send them back because on one hand, it would look horrible to send people back to the tortures they fled from. Our human rights record is as it is, in the toilet. But at the same time, we don't want these people here. They're not white, they're not Jews, they not bring money, they're not coming with huge bank accounts. And frankly, for years and decades, the government had predicated, it had put out this idea, we are the chosen people, and we must be, have this super majority of only Jews, because otherwise, if we're ever, a minority, we will be a persecuted minority, so we can't have, so there's too many Palestinians, we got to figure out ways to prevent them from reproducing and reduce the amount of Palestinian people. And once you have this new non-Jewish contingent in the country, the effort was the same. How do we drive them out? And so don't give them any work permits, don't give them any food stamps on the other hand, so how are they going to support themselves? Abject poverty, Basically, they're stuck in these neighborhoods that are impoverished to begin with, and then start legalizing certain measures, which then the government would actually just round these African men up into detention centers on the border with Egypt. Thousands of Africans just languishing. And while the Supreme Court has canceled or ruled unconstitutional these legal measures, the government is dead set on driving the Africans out. So it just re-legislated the exact same rules with a slightly different twist on it, but the effect is the same. Rounding people up off the streets and putting them in these camps so that their lives are so miserable that they just eventually, the hope is that they just give up, say, fine, I'd rather go back and die in my country of origin than languish here in this desert detention center for the rest of my life. Yes. And while this is happening, inciting racism against them. Now, I just quickly want to say, no one was really covering it. You had a little bit of coverage, but while government officials are inciting racism against this group of people, calling them spreaders of disease and criminals and and terrorists, you start to have anti-African rallies and anti-African race riots and people firebombing African people's homes and African kindergartens. And there's the anti-African marches through the city streets, and no one was covering them. And I was out there with my little camera, just walking around as people are screaming, "Get out of here, and so that's really how this thing took off, because I was just a man on the street with the camera documenting what was going on, which was horrific to me by North American standards, but which has become, normality in Israel.
When you were talking about how we would not give them work and we would not give them food stamps, we would make them miserable, it very much reminds me of a statement that I read not too long ago attributed to Moshe Dayan, who was put in charge of the West Bank after the '67 war. And he's reported to have said to a group of Palestinians at one point, "You will live like dogs. We will make you so miserable, and then you will go away." So it sounds like there's some of that same sort of approach. Well, how was your work received? I mean, were Israeli outlets, news outlets, were they using the film that you were bringing forward, or did you have to get it out of the country to get it accepted?
Right. Well, I mean, in some cases, I was the only person filming. In other cases, there would be, someone else filming, and then it would be like a 10-second clip on television and framed in such a way that, you wouldn't see the gravity of it all. But the truth is that most of my contributions to the discourse are in the English language, because ultimately, there's nothing that I report on, or very little that I report on, that isn't already at the same time published in the Israeli media in Hebrew. So it's not that the average Israeli is looking to me to be informed by what's going on in the country. It's out there in the in the public discourse. Really, my contribution is because I speak both English and Hebrew fluently, and I'm reporting on this in English. It's for many, and frankly, because the mainstream media here in North America is completely glossing over these issues and censoring news of these horror stories. That's really my main contribution, seemingly the fact that, I'm putting it out there in English, subtitling these horrific videos into English so that people can get a sense, a visceral sense of the palpable, hate that's on the streets.
Well, let me ask you, have you seen some of this same effort on the part of Israeli leaders? I know you've said, I think I've read where you said that political leaders, religious leaders were generating this kind of hate language and hate feeling. Have you seen some of that also going on with regard to Palestinians?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's always been the case. In the last several years, it's definitely been on the upswing. And since the summer, since the latest assault on Gaza, it's just like in the stratosphere. I mean, the most recent example, just a couple days ago, we have the foreign minister of the country, Avigdor Lieberman, who just like outright says, if these Palestinian citizens of Israel aren't loyal, off with their heads. We're going to cut off their heads, like ISIS or something. You know, like this is medieval, barbaric, completely in character for him. You know, and this is the same politician that for years we have mainstream Jewish leaders and mainstream American politicians essentially carrying water for, and you know, saying, oh no, he's not so bad, oh he's pragmatic, you know, Jody Redorn of the New York Times, oh, you know, like, you know, here's someone you can deal with, please. I mean,
well, you know, I saw an article on the online news source, Mondovice.
yes,
Two people there had written an article about this that you just mentioned, about Lieberman, and said that the New York Times had yet to even cover that statement.
Yeah.
But as they pointed out, you can just imagine that if somebody in the, say, Palestinian Authority, one of their officials, had said, if the Israeli Jews don't like us, we should just cut their heads off.
Yeah.
That you know that would be covered in the New York Times.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And this is just one example out of so many examples. It's all the time. It's just like every other day. Literally, I need a team of people. You know what I mean? To cover this stuff, because I don't even get to all of it. If that's what I was doing, you know. And so whether it's people calling the Africans cancer, or Netanyahu comparing them to Ebola, or like we have the Jewish Home Party, which is a party that sits with the government and will very likely sit with the next government. And we have someone on their list, a candidate who outright says, yeah, what are we going to do when we start death camps again for the non-Jews? It's like there's literally no barrier that people have not crossed in the run-up to this election, and even before it, in the level of incitement towards non-Jewish populations in Israel. And it would shock people if it was published in English, but it's not published in English. Right. It hasn't. It's, you know, me and a handful of other people maybe that are publishing this stuff. I'll just give you one quick example. Mohammed Abu Khder, this young Palestinian boy that was kidnapped outside his parents' home in East Jerusalem this past summer, and he was taken and he was beaten, and they poured gasoline down his throat and burned him to death from the inside out. Now, the day before this happened, a member of Jerusalem City Council, who was actually responsible for security for the city of Jerusalem, spoke openly to a crowd of Israeli students saying, yes, we need to commit acts of Phineas. Now, again, it's coded language, it's for Torah scholars, but you can open your Bible to the book of Numbers, chapter 23, 24, and you read about Phineas, and it's about this, again, it's coded language. You read about this Israelite priest, supposedly, according to the mythology, who was so incensed that Jews and non-Jews, or Israelites and non-Israelites, were copulating and cohabitating and having romantic relationships with one another, that he took his spear and he murdered and mutilated. He actually ran his spear through the man, and this Israelite man and this Midianite woman that were in the throes of lovemaking, and driving it right through their intertwined genitals. And so now this city councilor for the city of Jerusalem is saying, go out there and commit acts of Phineas.
Oh, wow.
experience of being, a minority of maybe Jews are 1 or 2% of the population there. To me, the fact that no one was a majority was actually a positive thing. It felt like no one ethnic group walked around like they owned the place. It felt like there was everyone kind of respected each other, and the teachers, the schools taught tolerance, and we saw multiculturalism as a good thing. So I brought those values with me when I moved to Israel. Now, clearly, Jews are, I don't know if it's 75% or I don't know exactly the percentage of people. Also, it depends how you define. What are Israel's borders? Who knows? They've never been defined. But if you look at the landmass, Jews are actually only 50% of the population right now.
You're talking about now from the Mediterranean to the Jordan.
That's right. Yeah, including occupied territories, West Bank and such, and Gaza. So if you look at it like that, already Jews are in the minority or will be in the next 5 minutes. So am I afraid of that? Well, that's already 50% of the population, or even 40% of the population is 20 times what I was used to growing up, and I never felt afraid for my life there. Now, yes, there is bad blood. Yes, there has been a century of bloodshed between Jewish people and non-Jewish people in the country. So we have to get past that. There's always a possibility of slipping into, race riots, but we have other examples to look at that we can learn from. We have South Africa, and Truth and Reconciliation Committee. How can we get past it? We have Northern Ireland. We have, Macedonia. There's places in history and that we can look to and try to figure out how can we build a culture in which we can work through this horrid history that we've created for ourselves and move forward.
Well, I know for myself, I've been there just 3 times.
Yeah.
I'm going back again this summer. But among the Palestinians that I've met and talked with at length, I've not picked up an attitude of, boy, would I like to
genocide those Jews.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I just have, what I hear over and over again is we really want to just be allowed to live. We want to be allowed our rights, and we are not against Jews. It's the policies of that state. In fact, people there tell me we have many Jews that come into the West Bank and they help us. They protest with us, or they come in and take goods that we make here and take them back into Israel and sell them for us. So there's a fair amount, to me it was surprising, of goodwill still.
Anyone who, I can't say anyone, but from my personal experience, I'll speak of myself. From my personal experience, I have Palestinian friends, and it's obvious to me that unless, I am completely naive and everyone is lying to me and it's all one big ruse and I'm an idiot, okay, well then, but then my whole life is idiocy, based on what I can tell you, there are people who seem to be the majority who want equality, who don't want ethnic cleansing, who want equality. And that's a legitimate thing to want. I want that. I don't want to be a citizen plus. I don't want to have more rights and privileges than other people. And I don't want other people to have less rights and privileges than me. I don't want to have less, and I don't want to have more. And so to me, this whole system is, it hurts me as well as the people who clearly are much more aggrieved by it, the people who are deprived their rights. But no, I know from my personal experience that we can get along. The people who don't know that are the people who don't have Palestinian friends, who don't have non-Jewish friends, who grew up in this ghetto that they've built for themselves, and who don't want to meet the other because they've been brainwashed either from the synagogue or from the state that the other is evil. And unfortunately, it's only exacerbated in recent years because since the Second Intifada, there's almost complete separation between the two societies, even more so than in the past. So where someone my age or older would at least have a memory of, oh yeah, I remember when I went to Nablus and I met this dude and we hung out and he was cool. Like then at least your own logic tells you, no, they're not all evil. It's a product of the situation and we need to. But for young for youth who grew up since that time, since 2001, Second Intifada, they don't even have any positive experience. They don't know any Palestinians, they never have. So in the schools today, you find that teachers don't want to talk about human rights, civil rights, it's even when it's part of the curriculum. I mean, it's not a massive part of the curriculum, but it's still part of the curriculum. Teachers don't want to talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it because the minute you open up Pandora's box, you have students screaming, yelling, death to the Arabs, we need to kick them all out. And this is students, to the point where teachers are afraid to even talk about it. This is the youth of today. It's sadly, every few years they conduct surveys where they ask students, well, would you be, it's so silly because of course in this country you wouldn't even fathom having a survey like this, but would you be willing to live on the same street as an Arab person? Would you be willing to study in the same school or classroom as an Arab person? And first of all, we're talking about 50% of Jewish Israeli youth don't. But we're also talking, you may want to, but also when you look at the statistics over the course of time, right? And you see that, okay, 20 years ago, and then 15 years ago, and then 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it's getting worse. Instead of getting better, instead of progressing to more open, like in some societies, perhaps in this one, we can at least count on next generation being less racist than the one that came before it, less homophobic than the one that came before it, less misogynistic than the one. This is the problem. This is why we're losing all hope, because we see how the youth are getting more and more racist over time.
Boy, that's a dark picture.
It's horrific.
And I would presume that you don't think that this upcoming election in Israel is likely to make much difference in that picture.
Sadly, there is no chance that the election will make any difference because the current Knesset accurately reflects where the people are. Mm-hmm. It's not like there's been a shift in public opinion. The only reason for elections were not because of a shift in public opinion. It was just because the government actually believed, or Netanyahu himself actually believed, that if elections were held, there would be even a bigger shift to the right, and he would have a coalition more suited to advance the legislation that he wanted to. He felt that some of his coalition members were only center-right, and not right enough, not far right, so he felt having another election could... And he may be right. Whatever happens, the Knesset's not going to be that different from the one that came before it. And if by some freak chance you have the Labour Party come into power, there's no difference because their policies are identical, whether it's about Palestinians, whether it's about Africans, regardless, across the board, they have the same public policies. You may see the slightest difference in terms of maybe less incitement, maybe less racist incitement coming from top government officials, so maybe less vigilantes scouring the streets for non-Jews to beat up. But you still have the same policies, the same stalemate, the same occupation, the same detention centers for Africans and deportations. And the only... what's worse is that the other governments in the world will say, oh, look, they've got a Labour government, so we don't have to apply any pressure. It's all good. Problem solved. Netanyahu's out. Case closed. When it's that's the worst thing that could possibly happen.
Yeah. I agree. It's been one of my fears is that somebody other than Netanyahu wins, and then the West can go into la-la land again and think, oh, we need to start the peace process again. Mm-hmm. Well, let me just say by way of closing that I think that this dark picture you're giving us is one that we very, very much need to know. And I'm so glad that I think you're working on a book about this, and that you're touring and giving speeches, because it strikes me that if and when more and more Americans hear about this, then maybe they will then press upon their representatives in Congress the notion that we don't wish to really be supporting a state of this sort. Yeah. It's too racist. It's too brutal. We don't want to do that. And I think that may be the point at which then the more moderate or sober or pragmatic elements in Israel will say, whoa, this is not working for us in the world. America is now going to stop giving us diplomatic immunity in the UN and all the money they're giving us, that maybe that will then bring about a change. At least that's my basis for optimism when I have it.
Well, look, people aren't doing us any favors. You know, if you think you're helping Israel, what you're helping are the furthest right elements in Israel.
You mean by continuing our support?
Yes, by continuing to provide Israel with diplomatic cover, with financial support, you're allowing the status quo to continue and for the situation to get worse. These are the facts on the ground. You'll hear me speak, just listen to any of my videos or read any of my articles, just example after example after example of the most basic, base discrimination and racist incitement that in this country, if any politician made a comment like this, they would be out, within minutes. But there, it's all good, and these people actually get promoted on the basis of these statements because they know it works for their electorate. They actually get more votes. This is how far we've come. We've come to the point where in this groupthink mentality, it's like a whole different set of values in which racism is actually prized, where it's actually considered to be a noble value, sadly. Now, if these are your values, Americans, I mean, America also has a horrific history of colonialism and ethnically
Racism
cleansing and
ethnic.
and genociding and slavery and it continues till this day. Looking from Ferguson to all across the country, there's major problems in this country. Well, if those are your values, then yes, you do have shared values with the Israel. And if you look back on the 40s and 50s and pre-civil rights era and say, those are the good old days, then yes, you do have shared values with the Israel of today. But if you aspire to something better, if you really want to be post-racial, if there is such a thing, or aspire to move in that direction, then you're not helping us. You're hindering us. You are actually disempowering those few Jewish Israelis who are trying to work from the inside to get past this racial hatred to create or co-create a more equal, like a society in which all are equal. So, keep your money, keep your votes, and if you want to do something to help, just let others know about what's really going on behind the scenes. We're documenting it. We're doing our part. It's on celluloid. All you need to do is press share and then see for yourself. If you're not shocked by it, I can't do anything else.
Well, maybe that work combined with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, you're I'm sure aware of that. Do you support that? Or are you one of those Israeli citizens who think, well, I know we're doing bad things, but I don't think we should boycott?
Well, I don't know if you know this, but in 2011, the Israeli Knesset actually passed a law that makes it an offense for any Israeli citizen to openly call for the boycott or divestment and sanctions of an Israeli company or corporation. What I've said for years and years, well before I worked as a journalist, which is, people need to practice economic democracy in every aspect of their lives. They need to withhold their hard-earned money from people who don't represent their values and don't reflect their values. And yes, when there's companies that are exploiting people or who are contributing to the exploitation of people, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Israel, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's in China or Mexico, we need to keep it local. First of all, make it yourself if you can. If you can't make it yourself, buy local and in places where you know the people who are making it are treating their employees right, treating animals right, treating the earth right. And so yes, I've already explained how horrible it is right now if you don't belong to the privileged ethnic group in Israel. And if that doesn't reflect your values, act accordingly.
Another place we have some hope here comes out of the document called Kairos Palestine, which came from the Christian community there. And we're in the beginnings of getting a sort of Kairos Maine movement, and we want to energize, to inform, to get more engaged the main communities of faith, because those communities have, as you know, back in history, whether it was in the slavery and the civil rights, those communities have been very powerful communities in seeking justice and seeking rights. Unfortunately, they've also been on the other side of that, but they've also been a real force for good in that way. So we're also hoping that that is going to be of some service. Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for coming to Maine. I want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing, and wish you the best as you go forward.
Thanks so much.
We'll
Thanks for
looking
having
forward
me.
to your book.
All right. All right.
Maybe you come back and give a talk about your book.
I'd like to. I'd love to do that. Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Bye-bye.